Hello everybody, and welcome to the Drydock episode 285. If you haven't noticed the community post that's gone up by now, I am popping over to the States for about 10 days in, well, at the time that this goes live, in about 4 days. And so, yeah, there is a schedule up on the website, there's a schedule on the community post, etc., etc. Spoiler alert, I'm basically going to be on the US South and East coasts, Southeast coast, basically, yeah, US South coast and going up to kind of the DC area, maybe a fraction north. So if you're somewhere on that grand arc of things, take a look if you want to come and say hi at one of the places I'll be stopping over. In any case, this week in Drydock episode 285, the questions are taken from Guides 356 and 357, that's USS Vestal and the Battlecruiser HMS Australia, with the Wednesday videos on Carrier Night Actions of World War II and Royal Navy Fleet Exercises, a series which I do need to continue at some point, and also a question or two from the first of the videos I did with John Partial on diving on the wrecks of Midway. So let's get on with questions. Daniel Regnard asks, I recently saw a comment where somebody was talking about a relative of theirs who served in the Royal Navy but was stationed aboard a US battleship in World War II as a link between the navies. How common was this sort of thing, and what would sailors such as this get up to when they were stationed on the warship of an ally? Broadly speaking, there are three main ways that could happen in the Second World War. So firstly, you might have a naval attaché or naval observer. This was more common before the US got stuck into World War II itself, but to a certain extent would continue afterwards. And that's, well, as the name suggests, they're there to essentially look at how an ally is doing things and see if that has any application to their own tactics and strategy, and occasionally chip in with information that they have. Then you have the best way to describe them would essentially be facilitators. So this comes about once the US and Royal Navies are acting in cooperation, and especially in the Pacific campaign, but also in other places as well. So where you've got ships operating alongside each other, and they may have different policies, procedures, and ways of doing things. So apart from the Pacific, you might think of when various US battleships sailed with the Royal Navy escorting the Arctic convoys, for instance, or the runs to Malta, which the USS Ranger did, the landings in Italy and on Sicily. In those cases, having somebody on hand on the other ship that's, might be communicated with, in order to explain what the communicating vessel meant, it was quite handy. So, for example, let's say when USS Washington is helping out with the Arctic convoys, there'll be certain orders, phrases, etc., which British ships would automatically understand, but American ships might not understand. Even a turn of phrase where the intent is clear, but perhaps the tone or something might be misread due to cultural differences. And so if you've got this kind of facilitator liaison officer aboard, then he can sort of say, oh, actually, what he means is this, or the gist of what he's getting at is this. And also, in terms of, if somebody's trained up in British at sea Royal Navy coding and decoding, and the ship has to sail pretty quickly to help out with an escort mission, it might be quicker to send over a Royal Navy cipher specialist rather than try and give the US cipher specialists aboard a crash course in how to decode Royal Navy encryptions. And, all sorts of things like that. And obviously the reciprocal applies. So US officers stationed on some British ships. And then finally, although a little bit more rarely than General Fleet Liaison, would be training, either cross-training or training in a tactic, strategy, or a piece of equipment that is looking to be adopted by the other navy. And that could mean radar, it could mean an operational method of doing things, it could mean a fire control system or a particular kind of gun, or even an aircraft, if the Royal Navy is adopting Avengers or something like that. Now, most of this would obviously be done on land or in test facilities, etc., etc. But occasionally, again, wartime expediency, if somebody or a group of people or even a whole group of ships on one side needed to be brought up to speed with something that the other party is using for whatever reason, then it might be easier just to send a bunch of people over to whichever navy and go, okay, well, teach us how to do this thing. So a little bit of a convoluted case, but one that theoretically could happen. Perhaps towards the end of the war, the Royal Navy has bought a Mark 37 fire control system from the US Navy. They did buy quite a few of them, and the British Pacific Fleet knows that a ship is going into refit and it's going to come out of refit with this system installed. Great, fantastic. Problem is, it's perhaps the system has been shipped to somewhere in the UK or maybe Australia or Ceylon or something like that, and it's being installed, but there's no training facility there to train the crew in how to use this system compared to their old system. So what might happen is, ideally before the ship heads off for its refit, or possibly if the ship already is in refit, then the Royal Navy might send some of the anti-aircraft fire control director crew from the fleet over to, let's say, an American battleship to learn how to use the Mark 37. And then when the ship that's been refitted shows back up again, those people can be transferred over or transferred back to the relevant vessel, and then they can teach all their new shipmates or former shipmates how to use the system. There are other circumstances as well, but those would be the most likely ones for World War II. Unryu Maru asks, despite being around 10 foot wider than the Iowas, which had 3 16-inch guns in each of their main turrets, the Bismarck class was only able to fit 2, not even 15-inch guns, okay, very, very slightly under, into its primary turrets. Were German reload mechanisms just that poorly developed, and would it be fair to assume that if the Panama Canal had been 120 foot wide, the Americans would have been able to fit 3 16-inch gun main turrets onto a hypothetical Bismarck width battleship if they'd built such a thing, or maybe even triple 18-inch? Right, so we've all probably seen this floating around the internet at some point. So that is at the top, Hood or generic British twin 15-inch gun, Bismarck in the middle, its twin 15-inch turret, and then Yamato's triple 18.1s at the bottom. But let's take a look at the interior of that turret for a minute. Now, in the past, I've mentioned issues with the fact that Krupp uses the horizontal sliding breech blocks, which is a problem. So if you look at the turret layouts of some of the other gun turrets, you can see that there is shaping along the sides, and also there's perhaps auxiliary facilities along the sides, whereas you can see here that on either outer side of the gun on Bismarck on each side of the turret, there is just a big lot of empty clear space because, well, yeah, nothing survives the breech block opening. But there are a few other issues as well. A lot of issues, actually. So one of the issues which causes the turret to be large, but is not, strictly speaking, a terrible thing, is there's actually an auxiliary ammunition hoist, which is towards the back of the turret. What exactly you're going to use that for, I'm not sure. I mean, it makes a good idea in theory. If your main ammunition hoist stops working, you can bring up at least some ammunition and keep firing. However, I would submit to you that if your turret's taken so much damage that your main ammunition hoist has stopped working, bringing more ammunition up into the turret is probably not going to help. But from maybe if there's a technical hitch or something, a jammed hoist, it might be a good idea. So we'll let that one slide. The big things you can see at the top right And bottom right of this image, labelled up top 24, 25, that's the ejection system for the brass cases that form the rear part of the charge. So, and again, that's contributing to the length of the turret, not the width. But you might notice a couple of differences from any battleship turret that you might have seen plans of otherwise, particularly obviously British, American or Japanese, or if you've been lucky enough to see the interior of one of the American museum battleships, its layout as well. And those issues run down the centre. So yes, at the back there, right in the middle, yes, that is a shell-ready rack. No, that is not a good idea. I mean, okay, shells are relatively inert, unless they're the high explosive ones, compared to the charges, but still, whilst it might mean your rate of fire is temporarily a little bit faster, if you are going to have a bunch of ready shells, that implies that you're also going to have a bunch of ready charges, because you can't really make one go without the other. Now, I get the theory, of course, that you would shoot these off very quickly in the early part of the engagement, hopefully before you're hit, but, well, that's generously optimistic thinking, shall we say. The other issue is what's sitting between the guns. You know, what is physically separating them so much, apart from the need to worry about sliding breech blocks, that is causing these two guns to be so widely spaced apart? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that's where the main ammunition hoists are. So yeah, if you're Ryan Szymanski or Travis on USS Texas, or almost anyone who has regular dealings with a battleship, you'll be familiar with the idea that you bring up, at least on battleship turrets, that you bring up the shells and the charges behind the guns, and then they get dropped in to the guns, into the breeches, and off they go. No, the Germans are very different. They have their main hoists in between the guns, and so that is a big contributor to the overall width of the turret, and that's essentially mandated in part because it's a commonality of design in German capital ships going back to World War I, but also in part because the space behind the guns where you would normally have the ammunition hoists and so forth, if you were vaguely sane, is taken up by the ejection systems for those brass cases and that shell-ready rack, amongst other things. So, having decided that they must have these systems in there, this is now the only space they can put them, and we end up with this absurdly wide turret. The idea of hoists, at least some of them being in between the guns, isn't an entirely foreign concept to other navies. If you've been aboard HMS Belfast, you'll know that the shell hoists actually come up between the 666-inch guns. But on battleships, because of the sheer size, yeah, the hoists are normally further back. So this is between the sliding breech blocks, the potentially not necessary redundant systems, and these other bits and pieces they've incorporated, including this central position for the ammunition hoist. This is why Bismarck's turret is so large. If the Americans had built a ship that was 120 foot wide, well, yeah, obviously they could get a triple 16-inch onto that. They could get a triple 16-inch onto a narrow vessel. Would they have gone for a quadruple or a triple 18-inch? Probably not. There are a number of good arguments that make sense within a US Navy context as to why they didn't go to 18-inch guns. They did look at them in the 1930s, but ultimately, even when it came to the Montanas, which were obviously going to be considerably wider than North Carolina, South Dakota, and Iowa class ships, they still went with just more triple 16s, and obviously with that extra width, you could get more AA, deeper torpedo protection systems, more spacing away from the side of the ship for the magazines, and so on and so forth, rather than go up to triple 18. It would have been technologically feasible, but they probably wouldn't have done so. Brendan Buersdorf asks, given how some ironclad ships like SMS Lyther or HMS Warrior survived in very out-of-the-way areas totally unknown until someone came to recover them, who understood their value, do you think there are any other ships hiding in plain sight like this, or do you think Warrior and Lyther were just extremely lucky? I think there probably still are some warships hiding away as oil jetties, train vessels, civilian vessels, etc., etc. But I don't think there are that many, and I don't think there are any particularly large ones left. I mean, Lyther's not particularly large, so perhaps there are a few other river monitors poking around out there somewhere. But something the size of Warrior, I think, is now gone, because the era of using old ships, especially old warships, for, in Warrior's case, use as an oil jetty and things like this, is somewhat gone now. So a lot of the ships that were used for that have now been scrapped, and actually probably have been scrapped for decades. Plus, even if they haven't been, the physical deterioration, as well built as they would have been in the 19th century, has probably caught up to them. And once you get into the 20th century, weirdly enough, as ship design gets more and more scientific, the actual longevity of ships as hulks, effectively neglected, actually becomes shorter. Because back in the Victorian period, whilst they did have a lot of scientific calculations so that they could do to work out the number of beams and the thickness of beams and how many frames, etc., that you needed, they weren't necessarily as precise. They knew most of the equations, but to actually do the calculations, which were all obviously done manually at that point, would take far too long, so they would use approximates. And most Victorian engineers, or at least the ones building warships, whilst they weren't massively over-engineering them, they did tend to err on the side of the over-engineering. So, if you've got a calculation that says that let's say the ribs of a ship should be 4.75 inches thick, for whatever reason, a Victorian engineer is more likely to go, well, you know what, let's round it up to 5 just to be on the safe side. And that explains the longevity of a lot of Victorian ironclads. Warrior, I mean, look at Cerberus. I mean, okay, she's decayed quite badly, but given how the state that she was left in, how far she's gotten. Or the old HMS Hood, the pre-Dreadnought, which is still kind of there as a breakwater. So once you get to a more scientific age, you can make those tolerances a little bit finer, but that, of course, means that there's less mass there. They are a more efficient design, but they won't last as long if you neglect them. I think if you're looking for warships hiding away, they're most likely going to be small things like MTBs, MGBs, PT boats, that kind of scale of thing. Maybe the odd corvette or frigate. Those might still be hiding out in civilian guise or some other guys somewhere else. But broadly speaking, I think the era of showing up to something that's actually still afloat but completely unrecognizable and going, hey, isn't this originally such and such a major warship, I think unfortunately is probably over now. BK Zhong asks, a common criticism of the original battlecruiser concept shown with Invincible, which I tend to agree with, is that while the battlecruiser is a tactically effective ship when used properly against lesser opponents, strategically you end up with a capital ship that cannot be used as a capital ship, i.e. fully against other capital ships, making it a poor investment overall. What are your thoughts on this? I wouldn't necessarily agree that at the time of their conception, the battlecruiser was a poor investment overall. If you look through Admiral Fisher's, his autobiography, and also his letters, which have been published, or at least a good portion of them, you get a sense of what he wants the battlecruisers to be used for, and also you can look at other studies as well. And yes, obviously they're very effective against ships that are lesser than them. And yes, you don't want to put an Invincible in the main battle line. However, they do have limited capabilities against capital ships. And this is something Fisher notes, that if the enemy runs away, which he expects the enemy to do quite a lot when the Royal Navy is involved, then in his view, a battle cruiser or a set of battle cruisers can chase them down and try and force them into action, primarily it seems essentially what he's saying is pick off the stragglers. So use their speed and, at that point, in theory, numbers to pick off and mob single straggling vessels. Because, of course, once you get a few hits in, that ship's probably going to start losing speed, and then they can be chewed up by the rest of the battle fleet. And Fisher is mainly thinking about battle cruisers using extreme range and combined with speed to keep them safe. So that's one possible role. There's also the other role potentially against capital ships, which is used as a fast wing to head off the enemy, which means they can engage capital ships in theory without being engaged too much by themselves. Again, Fisher's concept is that if you have two battle lines going at each other, in theory, the Royal Navy battle line should be the larger of the two, so any enemy battleships are going to be engaged fully with British battleships, but then you can have your fast wing made up of Invincibles sweep around the front of the enemy line, which will then give a huge concentration of fire on the enemy vanguard, which can theoretically switch some of its forward-facing guns to try and deal with the Invincibles, but thus taking the pressure off the British battleships. But the British battleships are the ones that are broadside on to the enemy battleships, and thus the much bigger threat. And also in World War I, split fire is a lot more difficult to do accurately. So there are essentially two cases, at least in Fisher's thinking, where you can use an Invincible against enemy capital ships without putting it at too much risk. But the larger issues is not so much what the Invincibles can go up against 1v1, but what they afford the fleet as a strategic tool. And that is, firstly, the very original concept for the battlecruiser, and they're supposed to be primary purpose in their original form, to hunt down enemy armoured and protected cruisers at high speed. Whilst, yes, they're beating up on ships smaller than them, the point of that was to reduce the number of cruisers that the Royal Navy had overseas, so that they could bring those cruisers back to form the main screen and escort for the fleet. So that the strategic advantage of building something as big and expensive as an Invincible is, in theory, that you can bring back 3 or 4 times its cost in regular cruisers to serve in what would eventually become the Grand Fleet, whilst actually theoretically enhancing your security overseas. Because if you have something like von Spee showing up, well, as von Spee showed, he might be able to beat a regular British cruiser force, and he might be able to outrun or outmaneuver a regular British cruiser force, but he can't beat, outrun, or outmaneuver the battle cruisers. And the other strategic advantage is, when it comes to the battle line itself, the scouting, because if both sides now have large cruiser screens, which, if unopposed, could deliver both scouting and torpedo attacks to the enemy, plus drive off enemy destroyers, and escort your own destroyers for that matter, having battle cruisers present means that you can also punch a hole through or sweep aside the enemy cruiser screen, which gives you effectively unlimited recon, whilst denying the enemy any recon of your own fleet, plus opening, obviously, a hole for your own smaller, faster torpedo-armed ships to run in and deliver attacks to the enemy battle line. So, whilst there is a small amount of capital ship engagement involved in the Invincibles thought, the primary role of the Invincibles is as a huge strategic multiplier for your fleet in various theatres, and in that, by allowing you and enabling you to both get recon and to utilise other ships in ways that you wouldn't be able to, they do make actually a very good investment overall, assuming, of course, that the other side doesn't do the same thing and build their own battle cruisers, which, of course, they do, which slightly lessens the utility of them, although not entirely, because essentially it just means the enemy is mirror matching your capabilities for the battle line, but the Invincibles are still doing their job of allowing you to redeploy a large number of your frontline cruisers back home. So there is still that advantage. Scott Giles asks, I was suddenly struck by how much money was burnt building the capital ships of World War I. Is it possible to give a total inflation-adjusted figure for all major navies and close associates such as Australia, as in this example, this coming from the HMS Australia video? So in theory, yes, it is possible to give such a figure because the costs of the capital ships are known. You do have to make a few adjustments for things like the fact that in World War I, the most commonly stated costs for a lot of American dreadnoughts, for instance, don't actually include rather major things like the armament, which is a accounting trick that various navies have used over time. The larger problem, however, is accurately assessing the relative value of the ship in question compared to nowadays. And the reason I say that is that when you're talking about the value of, let's say, the amount of gold that Drake brought back from his voyage around the world, or the cost of a dreadnought, purely using inflation-adjusted figures is not actually really a safe assessment of how much such a thing would actually cost, or the relative impact of such a cost to the modern-day economy. Inflation is fine for tracking things like, how much is the money in my bank account worth compared to how much it was worth 5 years ago, the kind of relatively short-term stuff. But when you look in the long form, there are some rather different values which you can pick. So if you take, say, for example, Australia, which was roughly speaking £2 million, then if you use the RPI inflation index, in modern terms, that would be £235 million, which, when you stop to think about it, is equivalent to a, relatively speaking, cheap frigate. These days the Royal Navy is supposed to be building the Type 31 frigates, which are, small, not quite, but almost second-line frigates. And they cost about, $250, so just a fraction over £235 million, at least projected. And you can immediately see the problem, because inflation adjusted, you're looking at it going, well, these are major capital ship investments. These are the creme de la creme of the fleet. Their proportional cost should not be the same as a Type 31. A Type 31, going backwards, would be the equivalent of something like a World War I era Arethusa light cruiser, not a battle cruiser. But then you look at other ways of measuring the total inflationary value of product or good, like a ship. So you've got the labor value, and the labor value looks at essentially what is the average worker's wage in, let's say, 1912, and what is the average worker's wage for the same country these days, obviously the UK, because that's where the ship's built. And then you use that as a multiple. So, or £2 million, how many multiples of the average worker's wage is that in 1912? And then take that number of multiples, apply it to the average worker's wage in modern day Britain, and that it gives you another value. So that suggests that the Australia would be worth about £890 million. Which, okay, we're now getting into the realm of a large destroyer. Not quite as much as, say, a Type 45, but maybe it's beginning to sound a bit more plausible. But you can also assess it by the income value. Income value works off of GDP per capita, which, of course, can be skewed by the mega rich, the billionaires and so forth, but essentially works at roughly the same principle as the labour value. But that would suggest that the Australia is worth about £1,340-ish million. And so now Australia is costing a bit more than a Type 45, a fairly major surface combatant for the Royal Navy these days, but is not costing as much as, say, a Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carrier, which is understandable because the Queen Elizabeth is, almost 3 times the Australia's displacement. But then you've got the last one, and when you're looking at long-term figures, this is actually the figure that I tend to prefer to use, which is the economic share. So you look at the GDP of the country in question. Again, in this case, it's the UK, because although Australia is paying for it, it's being built in the UK. And you say, okay, well, this is how much the GDP was in this time period. This is the cost of this item. And working out the two between the two, divide one by the other, gives you the proportion of GDP that this expense has cost you. And then you can say, okay, well, if something was going to cost that same portion of GDP, it would have the same economic impact in terms of having to pay for it. And I think that's a much more realistic way of looking at long-term price differentials, because the size of an economy versus the inflation of its currency can radically diverge over 100 plus years, at which point you can get figures like, again, looking really far back at Drake's loot from his voyage around the world, inflationary adjusted, it's not all that much. But when you look at how much it was worth in the 16th century, Drake came back with more than the entire tax revenue for the country for that year several times over, which proportionally now for the if there's someone came back with loot worth several times HMRC's annual takings, that would be a colossally stupid amount of money. But it would have roughly the same economic impact, which is why the economic share, I think, is the better way of assessing it. And the economic share of £2 million in 2012 is about £2.150 billion in today's money. And given that the UK paid a little bit over $3 billion eventually for each of the QE class carriers that we've got these days, just over $2 billion for a slightly smaller vessel, but still a vessel that is the big, complex, frontline, expensive warship of its period. That proportionally is, at least to me, a lot better a way of estimating the overall impact on the economy, and therefore the actual value in modern terms of a ship like Australia, which actually, funnily enough, given Australia's cost, is approximately a 10 times multiplier. So at least for the UK, because of course the change in economy, share, etc., is going to be different for the US, Germany, etc., etc. But at least for the UK, if you want to look at how much the Royal Navy's building spree from Dreadnought onward cost, you can actually just look up the cost of each ship, or the cost of each ship in each class, add them all together and multiply by 10, and that'll give you a, roughly speaking, idea, a decent-ish idea of what they were spending proportional to what it is these days, which turns out to be a slightly frightening figure, because it took the UK about 8 years per ship from keel laying to commissioning for the modern Queen Elizabeth class carriers, and their total cost is estimated, although it was a little bit inflated by government shenanigans, to be around about £7.5 billion. Now, the cost of building a class of 4 battleships is using the economic measure that I mentioned earlier, is actually disturbingly close to that. It's around 7.5 to 8 billion adjusted, as I said, using this economic measure, which means that whilst in the modern day the Royal Navy spent 7.5-ish billion over 8 years, back then the Royal Navy was spending that amount each year to keep up in the Dreadnought race, and sometimes a little bit more, and that's just looking at capital ships. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, I remember reading about how the US conducted the Small Battleship Study in 1919, where the US looked at 21 to 25,000 ton designs for a battleship that more resembled a pre-Dreadnought. Do you have any further information on this, and if the US had gone through with it, how do you think the vessels they built would have performed? Well, the US actually looked at quite a lot of different alternatives, as they were wont to do during their design studies, And they ranged across an even broader spectrum than you might think. So this particular example, which you can see on screen at the moment, is a 21,500-ton ship that has a pair of twin turrets mounting 16-inch guns and a maximum speed of 18 knots, so very much a kind of modern pre-dreadnought. But it goes up. So most of the designs do have 4 16-inch guns into twin turrets. There are some which have 6 guns into triple turrets, but speed and armor vary. And so you end up with one of the larger ones being Scheme D11, which is actually 37,000 tons, if you can believe it. So actually displaces more by a reasonable margin than a Colorado-class battleship, but still only has the 4 guns, but it does have a maximum speed of 29 knots. So essentially what you've made is slightly more heavily armored US version of the Courageous class, because at least it does at least have armor, 12 inches of armor in fact, and is driven by turbo-electric drive, 710 foot long as well, so not an insubstantial vessel, planned with 6-inch turret-mounted secondaries, which is pretty much the same across all the designs. You can see this one also has turret-mounted secondaries in the 6-inch caliber. This one in the picture, which is the small version, right at the low end of the scale, at mere 18 knots, is only 500 feet long. And near enough all the designs also have the 12-inch belt, which again you can see illustrated on the picture above. So the initial reason that they even looked at this in the first place was that one of the US admirals was concerned at the ever-spiraling increase in size, displacement, and therefore cost of capital ships, and wanted to see, if you pared it back down to basics, what could you get? The initial run was mostly supposed to be using a standardized armament layout. So those 6-inch turrets are triples, so you have 12 6-inch guns for secondaries, you have your 2 twin 16-inch for primary, and you have a 12-inch belt on the side. As we mentioned earlier, one of them was designed with triple turrets anyway for the main battery, but nonetheless the idea was to see, okay, with a uniform set of design requirements for firepower and protection, what is the effect of speed on displacement? And, well, it turned out that, the square cube law really does work to your advantage when you're building a battleship, but it works against you when you try to downscale, because you ended up with a ship with ship designs that were far less capable than a Colorado or a South Dakota, the 1920s version. They were slower, they were less well protected, and of course they had half or less than half of the armament, but they were still taking 2/3 of the displacement. And once you got up to speed, then obviously they went over. So having seen that, okay, small battleships don't work in that context, because also remember you've got to include torpedo protection now that it's post-World War I, they decided to switch up a bit and see, okay, well, what happens if we increase the belt protection up to 13.5 inches, which is the same as the US standard class in the latter period, and play around with speed, play around with twins and triples, throw various things into the fire, see if we can come up with something that works. Turns out no. And in large part, this was one of the reasons why the US backed sticking at the 35,000-ton limit for the Washington Naval Treaty rather than trying to downscale it, because they pretty much come to the conclusion that you really couldn't build an efficient modern battleship on much of a smaller scale than what people were already doing. If the US had gone through with it, the vessels would have been, to be honest, pretty terrible, because, as mentioned, as the US themselves concluded, they're very, very inefficient for the amount of resources you put into them versus what you get out of them. And if they'd gone with the first run or even some of the second run proposals, even in 1919, 1920, they would have been under-armoured, incredibly slow, and woefully under-armed, with the exception, perhaps, of some of the bigger ones, which obviously would have had adequate to good speed, but still wouldn't have been able to fight it out with anyone serious because, half the guns and less protection. Nathan Hubler asks, It seems to me from your description of the 1929 fleet exercises that the American and British navies had somewhat different goals in their wargaming. From your videos on the American fleet problems, I came to the conclusion that the Admiralty is trying to suss out what strategy would be necessary in the probable coming war. It's not to deny that operations and tactics were also examined, but the emphasis seems to be on strategy, whereas the British Admiralty seems to have been more testing operations and tactics for a strategy they have already founded. Is this, in your opinion, a good conclusion? And if so, why? The long-standing tradition and experience of the Royal Navy versus the relative inexperience on the global stage and in world power warfare of the US Navy? The assumption by the Royal Navy they'd be fighting a similar war to the one they just fought in, or something else? I'd say your conclusion is broadly accurate. The reasoning for the US fleet exercises, the fleet problems, looking largely at overall grand strategy and some rather fixed scenarios, essentially comes down to the fact that the continental United States is an ocean away from anyone who would actually threaten it, which means that the actual threats to the homeland are going to take some time to develop. The US also has relatively limited overseas holdings, and so what threats might come after them, primarily the Philippines and so forth, are relatively predictable, as therefore are the enemies. So what you have to test, apart from obviously new tactics and technologies like airships and aircraft carriers as they come online, is what's the best way to assemble your fleet, because you've got the time and space to do that, and then fight a war in a way that leads to a decisive victory. So that's the broad thinking of most of the US Navy at the time, and the detail is what the fleet problems are trying to work out. And yes, part of that simply is the fact that at this stage the US Navy doesn't have a huge amount of experience with being a top-tier, top-dog navy that has to think about responding to global threats. Conversely, the Royal Navy has at this point centuries of that kind of experience under its belt, and between that and the fact the British Empire is very scattered across the planet, they are perfectly aware that wars tend to develop in ways that you do not anticipate them developing, and they tend to pop up in the most annoying of places, usually when your ships are not really in place to deal with it all. The fact that World War I was kind of seen coming a mile off, and therefore they could assemble a Grand Fleet, was a bit of an anomaly in British strategic history. And so, although they had a big navy, the Royal Navy was very conscious of the fact that, especially in the opening stages of any war, you might have isolated elements of the Royal Navy that had to conduct very random missions with whatever they happened to have to hand. And so the fleet exercises the Royal Navy undertakes tend to be more of this very tactical scenario type where, what might you need to do? You might need to escort a convoy. What kind of convoy? It doesn't really matter. Troops, supplies, repairs, oilers, anything. You need to escort the convoy. Okay, what's the best way of escorting a convoy against modern threats? That's what the exercise is designed to show. Not how do we escort a convoy from point A to point B, which is representative of this particular nation, with this particular nation's navy coming after it, which would be more of a US fleet problem. It was just generically, bad guys are coming to attack your convoy, defend your convoy. Because then if the captain and crews have experience in how to do that, then theoretically, wherever they are in the world, if they're suddenly told you have to defend a convoy, then they can go, oh, okay, we know how to do that. And so on and so forth through the scenarios. Now, that's not to say there aren't big fleet action scenarios in the Royal Navy fleet exercises. There definitely are, and when I come back to that series, we will cover a few of them. However, I would say essentially what the Royal Navy is trying to do with its fleet exercises in the interwar period is it's trying to generate a toolbox of experience from which captains and flag officers can draw in any given situation. So whatever ships they've got, wherever they are, whoever the enemy is, they've got a broad range of prior experience and knowledge, and they can go, right, okay, in this situation, we need to combine this, this, and this, but not this to do this. Whereas for the US Navy, with a somewhat more limited scope, as we mentioned, of different wars that it might realistically be chosen to fight or called upon to fight, they can look at a very, very large scale and go, right, how do we fight this war as a grand strategy rather than a kind of piecemeal put things together and hope for the best? And that's where their fleet problems kind of reflect that much larger campaign-style fighting. Miko Leitner asks, what is it with competent captains and admirals time and time again driving their battleships, cruisers or carriers ashore? Are there usually consequences to the people who are responsible for these incidents? It's usually a mixture of some things just flat out not being charted at the time, which in and of itself is sort of supplemented by the fact that these days virtually every warship worth its salt has sonar, so depth sounders and so forth, so that you can see there's a sandbank or a rock ahead of you, at least if you're traveling at a reasonably slow speed. And so hopefully you can take some action to avoid it or at least mitigate against problems. And of course you have much better surveying done these days. So that's one half of it. And the other half of it is just stuff moves, especially when you're talking about mud banks and sandbanks. You look at a chart that might be a year old and the sandbank was over there. And today, a year later, it's now over here, but you don't know it's over here. And so you go through what you think is clear water and then bang, you've hit something. And then obviously combine that as well with the fact that you don't have GPS level precision navigation, and you might be going down a very clear empty channel as far as your navigation is aware. But if you happen to be off by a couple of 100 yards, you could be heading straight for a rock. And the first thing you're going to know about it, because you think you're in the clear channel, is when something goes crunch. And the more aggressive and the more inventive that captains and admirals become, then the more and more likely these things are to occur. And, well, even these days, ships occasionally smack into solid objects that you wonder how they manage that. But it's much rarer thanks to the various factors we just mentioned having advanced somewhat. But in terms of consequences, it depends on the time period in the Navy. Sometimes there are very severe consequences for almost any incident. Other times there are almost none. And as I say, sometimes it depends on the culture of the Navy, and sometimes it depends on what is happening all around. So if you are, let's say these days, in charge of a warship and you smack it into a rock or a sandbank or something hard enough to stick, that your career is pretty much over. And in peacetime, in extended periods of peace, in certain navies at certain times, this would still be the case. Basically, bureaucracy takes over and goes, well, you have made this error, this makes you less than perfect, therefore, bye-bye. Which breeds sort of conservatism and small c conservatism and not taking any real risks, which is not really what you actually want in a captain of a warship, but it is what the bean counter's like. Whereas when navies are being a bit more forgiving, perhaps because they are just coming off of wartime, so they have learned the lessons of wartime, or they're in times of tension in the run-up to wartime, then they can be more forgiving, or perhaps they've just got a sane admiral in charge for a change. The reason a picture of young Chester Nimitz is up here is because he, of course, did run one of his early commands, a destroyer, aground. If he'd done that these days, that would have been so long farewell, auf Wiedersehen and good night for his career, but at the time, obviously there would be an inquiry, and they'd look into the circumstances, and then they concluded, well, on balance, could happen to anyone. Try not to do it again next time. Good luck with your next command. And of course, then you have in wartime, unless you were truly epically incompetent, it'll just be written off as fortunes of war. So, for example, in one of the battles in the Mediterranean, Warspite was going a bit slower because she touched a sandbank or mud bank coming out of Alexandria, ingested some mud, and this was playing havoc with her boilers. It was an annoying tactical detail to that battle, but nothing, as far as I'm aware, actually happened to the ship's captain, or indeed, obviously, Admiral Cunningham as a result, because people just shrugged and said, well, in the grand scheme of things, touching a mud bank is far from the worst thing that could have happened that day. The Outer Circle asks, in the Age of Sail, ships carried spare materials for the carpenter, but in movies like Master and Commander, we see a lot of the decorative work shot away in the first engagement. Would the valuable timber on board be used to repair these, or would green timber or purchased timbers from ashore be used? Also, the prevalence of paint. In the 1800s, I know captains purchased paints and materials to fancy up their ships, and I would assume some stores went to sea, but with space at a premium, such as with timber, was paint purchased as needed? In terms of the ship's decorations, usually they wouldn't be repaired. If it was something like the ship's figurehead, that might merit a bit of repair, usually from spare chunks of wood lying around after the battle from the ship's carpenter. But the more regular decorations on the ship, if the ship's expecting to see combat again during its voyage, the carpenter's going to make themselves busy with actually repairing the ship and keeping a limited stock of timber on hand for further repairs, rather than prettying the stern of the ship up again. Although, again, if you're part of a big fleet and you've won a battle and you're heading into dock, or you're heading across the ocean towards dock, then you might make at least some repairs. You're probably not going to carve out whole new sections of stern decoration, but you might at least try and put the bigger pieces back together with some interim supports or something like that. In terms of paint, stores did go to sea, but not necessarily in the way you would think, because you don't have refrigeration on Age of Sail ships. You also don't have paint tins, for that matter, in the way that we might think of them today. So if you had fresh paint, it might well be dry by the time you've come to use it, or spilled, or worse. So what they would do is they would actually carry the raw materials. So, all sorts of things for different colours. And bear in mind, not just the colours you need for the outside of the ship. You might be carrying the base components to make colours which you can then mix to create other colours, which might then go on the ship. And because those will be dry components, they are much easier to carry and store aboard the ship, both safely and in terms of preservation. And usually this would be accompanied by the carriage of just neat linseed oil, which would be the thing that all the ingredients are mixed into to form the paint. That would be a typical way of making sure the ship needs to be painted. And remember, painting of the ship for most of the Age of Sail, whilst obviously the bow and stern decorations are there for show, the bulk of the ship is painted more out of a practicality to stop it rotting than anything else. So there is a near constant program of maintenance going on when you're not being actively shot at. But also remember that different paints have different levels of longevity, and different paint color base materials cost different amounts of money. So whilst usually you would have a black underlayer, almost like a primer coat for the hull, what you put on top of that could vary. The Royal Navy was one of the first to bring in what was supposed to be a relatively uniform set of ship colorations compared to the French and Spanish, who are a bit behind on that. But, for example, we know that the Spanish did have a somewhat preference, although not a universal one, during the classic Age of Sail for red or maroon striping on their hulls. But we know of at least two ships at Trafalgar that were described as having black hulls, essentially because the red or maroon paint was a bit expensive and it did tend to fade and fall off relatively quickly compared to the black paint. So what you're seeing with some of the Spanish ships is not that they've been deliberately painted black, it's that that's their undercoat layers and they just haven't had the time or money to maintain the outer layering, whether that be a whole red hull or red striped hull, and as a result it's washed off or flaked off and left the undercoat there. My Mum's Basement Needs More Windows asks, British sailors are called limeys because they were given limes to combat scurvy. Why did the Royal Navy choose limes rather than some other citrus fruit? And what nickname would the sailors have if a grapefruit had been chosen instead? Well, if grapefruit had been used, given that limey originated as a semi-pejorative from the US, I would have to defer to the US viewers. What is an American, vaguely pejorative nickname for a grapefruit? And, well, that's probably what they would have been called. Now, as far as why the Royal Navy ended up using lime juice instead of anything else, and hence, obviously, ending up with that nickname, was because originally they didn't choose lime juice. When they finally got their act together and worked out that all the people who'd been telling them for the past few decades that you really need citrus, which is essentially now we know is the vitamin C element of it, but fruit juice or fresh fruit to combat scurvy, they actually settled on what's technically speaking the best one that they had available, the best option, which was lemon juice. Unfortunately, having come to that decision, they very quickly ended up at war with Spain. One of the many times we've ended up at war with Spain. And they decided that, well, with the Spanish directly controlling the access routes to most of the areas where they could get large numbers of relatively cheap lemons, the Spanish probably weren't going to suspend hostilities for random British merchant ships going in and saying, look, can I have a hold full of lemons, please, for reasons. And so they had to look further afield, and they discovered that, well, limes are a fruit, and they look vaguely like lemons, except for the coloration, and we have access to a lot of them. Therefore, we shall use lime juice instead of lemon juice. And fortunately for them, lime juice and lemon juice are similar enough in vitamin C content that it had pretty much the same effect in terms of fighting scurvy. And then by the time the war was over and access to lemons had been restored, then, well, two things. One, it had been made clear that access to lemons could be taken away again if hostilities broke out in the future. And two, by this stage, the Royal Navy had set up a whole infrastructure around the purchase, juicing and supply of lime juice to its sailors, usually actually mixed in with rum, hence the grog picture here. And so the lime juice stuck. Rob Smith asks, we hear a lot about the little dots in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but very little about the little dots in the middle of the Atlantic. For example, what roles did the Ascension, Azores, etc., perform? Primarily, the little dots in the Atlantic, when the Allies could get control of them, served the purpose of pretty much supplying bases for anti-submarine work, because you've heard of the Mid-Atlantic Gap. Well, one of the solutions to the Mid-Atlantic Gap, or in the case of Ascension Island, the South Atlantic Gap, was to just put air bases on small islands in the middle of the Atlantic, thus allowing aircraft to cover those areas. Ascension also had a secondary role in being used as a stopover point for aircraft that were transiting from America to the UK. Because whilst you might think, well, clearly the easiest way for aircraft to get from the US to the UK would be to fly over the Atlantic on what is today the standard jetliner route, so over Greenland and Iceland and then down to the UK. And some aircraft, particularly the long-range ones, could do this. Hence why there's a bunch of aircraft that didn't quite make it in the glaciers of Greenland. The shorter range aircraft, and at times when there was hostile air activity over the eastern part of the North Atlantic, meant that aircraft would actually go quite far south. They'd basically hop along the US coast, then down through the Caribbean, and actually go across the southern Atlantic, stopping off at Ascension, over to West Africa, and then hop their way up and eventually make their way to the European theatre wherever they were needed. So that was another important role for Ascension. The Azores, similarly, although not used really as a stopover for transatlantic aircraft trying to get to and from Europe, they were incredibly important in fighting the U-boats that were positioning themselves in the mid-Atlantic. Of course, the Azores belonged to Portugal, which did lead to a rather interesting scenario because, of course, you can't just rock up on somebody else's territory and set up air bases to fight a war, Iceland aside. And so there's actually a whole interesting story involving the world's oldest continuously running treaty, the medieval period, a battle that could have served and probably did serve as one of the inspirations for the Battle of Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. Some scrabbling around in the 19th century to find a copy of a treaty that people had managed to lose, and the world's best rules lawyer in the form of the President of Portugal, all of which will be told at some point in the future, possibly later this year, in relating the story of how the Azores ended up hosting a British airbase. Neil Horncole asks, we have heard about guns that were built for different countries during the World Wars. What were the different companies that actually developed the guns, and was it the companies themselves or the different navies that drove the size of guns and their caliber? There's a gradual trend as the market dries up in the interval period and going into World War II that it becomes more and more navy driven, i.e. the navy says we need this kind of gun for our ship, and therefore it's down to either a national gun or ordnance foundry or a private company to try and develop and test said gun and then bring it into service. But if you go back before World War I, it's a lot more freeform, because at that point, well, one, armaments companies tend to be somewhat larger than they are in the interwar period because a lot more ships are being built for their home nations, but also the foreign export market is quite a hot topic. And so some firms like Vickers Armstrong or Vickers and Armstrong, depending on whereabouts in the timeline you are before they merge, do try to develop their own guns, and often do succeed, in order to try and market those guns both to their home nations and to other nations who might be interested in purchasing them, to give them an advantage over their competitive commercial rivals. But there is still a degree of national ordnance factories developing their own guns as well. And this is perhaps best exemplified, or at least is a good example, is found in looking through the naval annuals that were published at the time. So if you look at the 1913 naval annual, which I just so happen to have in front of me, it has quite extensive tables of the naval ordnance known to be in use by specific navies. So there's British ordnance, Dutch ordnance, United States, Norway, Spain, etc., etc. But it also lists the ordnance that's available for sale by some gun manufacturers. Now, in this particular edition of the Naval Annual, it seems to only cover some European manufacturers, British, German, etc., but you'll see what I mean in a second. Now, bear in mind, 1913, so the Orion class are just coming into service, so the British have 13.5-inch guns just, but nothing bigger. But if you look at the LZIC breech loading and quick-firing guns and howitzers table, they have 40, 45, and 50 caliber 12-inch guns. Okay, we know about those. They have 45 caliber 13.5-inch guns. Okay, they're just coming into service. But they also list a 14-inch 45 caliber and a 16-inch 40 caliber gun, both of which are available for sale in 1913. Then we turn over the page, and we find that Vickers Sons and Maxim's guns and mountings are likewise offering 12-inch 45 and 12-inch 50 guns, as well as 13.5-inch, but they are also offering their own 14-inch 45 caliber gun and a 15-inch 45 caliber gun. So both of those not in service with the Royal Navy and larger, but you can buy them if you have the money. Coventry Ordnance Works is also offering a 14-inch 45 caliber gun. Beardmore is offering the 15-inch 42, despite the fact that in 1913 the 15-inch 42 is not actually, well, it has been tested, but it's not in active service yet and won't be for a while, aboard the QEs. And for some reason, possibly a typology error, they're also offering a 13.5-inch 46 caliber gun. Who knows what's going on there. Then you have Schneider guns, which are listed next. And of course, their measurements are in millimeters. Now, Schneider, of course, is French, and they're offering a 12-inch or 305mm gun in both 50 and 45 calibers. It's not particularly unusual because we know the French had those. They're also offering the 13.4-inch or 340mm gun in 40 and 45 caliber variants. That's the Britannia's main armament, at least one of those is. But they're also offering a 14.5-inch gun, or 370mm gun, in 40 and 45 caliber, and they're also offering a 400mm gun in, or 15.7-inch, in 40 and 45 caliber. Although it should be noted that the 13.4, 14.5, and 15.7 don't have close range perforations of steel targets listed. They do, however, have perforations of steel targets at just over 6,000 yards listed, which suggests that either someone has done enough design work to give a decent estimation of their penetration, or they've actually built and tested at least one of these gun barrels. And again, so that's 2 calibers larger than what the actual French Navy is using at the time. And then we get to Krupp. So that'll be the Germans. And they're offering 11-inch guns and 12-inch guns in various lengths, which of course is what the German Navy at the time is using. They are, however, also offering the 356mm or 14-inch gun in 40, 45, and 50 caliber. They're offering the 381mm or 15-inch gun in 40, 45, and 50 caliber, and the 406mm or 16-inch gun in 40, 45, and 50 caliber. None of those are in active service or even in design for the German Navy at this point. Of course, they would bring in the 15-inch with the Barnes and Bayerns, but not at the beginning of 1913, they're not. And then you have, who else have we got here? We've got Bethlehem Steel Ordnance. Now, they're kind of the runaway winners to a certain degree, because, of course, we know that the US Navy by 1913 is bringing the 14-inch gun into service, and they do offer the 14-inch 45 caliber gun. However, apropos of not a huge amount, they're also offering an 18-inch 30 caliber gun for some reason. I mean, it does have a lot of muzzle energy, but still. And then going over the page to the last manufacturer they list, which is Bofors, and Bofors are offering a variety of guns, 10-inch guns, 11-inch guns, and 12-inch guns, all in 40, 45, and 50 calibers. And of course, some of those calibers not used by the Swedish Navy either. And finally, Jay Borzak, I think, apologies for probably butchering your name horribly, asks, I really enjoyed your look at the wrecks of Midway. It was mentioned a few times throughout the video, particularly when talking about flight deck supports near the bow and the collapsed bridge, that it's difficult to tell if the damage was caused during combat or after the ship was sunk. Are there any good ways to differentiate the two, and if so, what methodology is used? Additionally, how does this ambiguity affect historical analysis? Well, one way is to look at damage reports or eyewitness accounts. If they saw damage occur, or we know a bomb or torpedo hit in a given area, and then you look at the wreck and there's a socking great hole there, was fairly obvious. You can draw the conclusion that this was a result of said bomb or torpedo hit. Or, you know, if someone says, well, I saw the bridge or the island fall over into the sea or something like that, then, and that's backed up by several witness statements, then when you find the bridge is missing, well, I guess they were right. But when it comes to determining what other damage may or may not have been caused by, you know, blast, fire, etc., on the surface, what might have been caused by the ship as it descends, and what might have been caused by the ship decaying on the seabed, that's very difficult, and there is no one methodology. Now, obviously, I am not an archaeologist, but I am an engineer, and I have studied what happens to ships when they get badly damaged. So I have an opinion, or at least some guidance to offer, but full-on marine archaeologists who may be watching obviously can chime in with a lot more details, etc. Now, one of the things that you can look at it to determine, you know, when did this damage occur, is if the thing is separated from the ship, how far is it separated from the ship? Because with currents and different resistances and the way things fall through the ocean, if you discover a debris field and something is near the start of that debris field, and then you follow the trail and you eventually come across the wreck of the ship itself, the stuff that's at the very start of that debris field is almost certainly going to be stuff that was blown off of the ship while it was on the surface or very close to it, simply because it will have fallen there, and obviously the trail shows that as the ship is coming down, it's shedding more and more parts. Something that is lying very close to or almost adjacent to the ship is probably something that has come off either as a result of the impact of it hitting the seabed or through decay later on. simply, as I said, because otherwise it would have fallen off with the other stuff. Now, really heavy stuff that may still be partially attached to the ship, like say if a pole mast collapses but is kind of bent over rather than snapped, that might stay attached to the ship even if it collapsed on the surface. So that's where you have to look back for eyewitness accounts and so forth. Another thing that you can look at is how that thing has been damaged and how that relates to the forces that the ship would have been undergoing. So if something is showing a fair degree of twisting and buckling and is not obviously fire damaged, and the damage has occurred in such a way that indicates great force in the vertical direction, and then that, and maybe a little bit in the forward direction, then that is almost certainly going to be damage that's been incurred when the ship has hit the seabed and stuff has just collapsed or been slammed down or something like that. Whereas, and obviously you have to account for what position is the ship in. If the ship has skidded sideways down the seabed, then you have to look for stuff that's bent in that direction rather than stuff that's bent forward as well. Whereas when you saw that bit of hull plating that John Partial pointed out, where it's basically been peeled up and over, that involves clearly a force that has originated from inside the ship and has both a upwards vertical and a horizontal component to it, which is the only explanation for how you would peel such a thing open like that. That suggests an internal explosion, which in turn suggests something that occurred on the surface before the fires were put out, because that is a fairly complex form of distortion, which isn't going to really be accounted for by the simple impact of a ship hitting the seabed, which will be mostly linear, because the ship will be going one way and the resistance will be coming the other way. And whilst the vortexes caused by a ship falling or spiraling down through the ocean are somewhat more complex, they're not that complex, and a ship would have to be moving at a fair old rate of knots to unfurl a whole section of hull plating like it can. So you can fairly logically conclude that this is damage that occurred at the surface. Obviously, really obvious stuff like shrapnel patterns and burn marks that are consistent with an explosion also give it away. Conversely, if something is badly damaged and there's shrapnel and burn marks that are in all sorts of random directions, then that indicates that this is perhaps post-sinking damage, and you can actually perhaps, if not physically, but at least on pictures, align the various bits so that all the blast and shrapnel damage lines up, which would show what it was like before, after the sort of man-made intervention damage that initially caused the problem. And of course there is some of the more obvious stuff like big impact and crushing damage on the lower portion of the ship. That's probably the ship hitting the seabed, whereas neat hole punch straight through 15 inches of armor, that tends to indicate man-made intervention. So, for example, if you looked at Bismarck's wreck, the fact that pretty much almost everything below her armor belt has pancaked up into a relatively thin but very dense layer, that is rather obviously post-sinking damage when the hull has crashed down onto the seabed. Whereas the hole in the conning tower, that just so happens to be about 16 inches across, that's probably Rodney's fault. And that wraps us up for this week. Thank you very much for listening. When the next Drydock comes out, I will hopefully be over in the States and saying hello to people. So see you there, maybe?